In the middle of the 14th century, folks just like you and me went to bed feeling perfectly fine and woke up dying. A fever would hit hard and fast, no warning at all. Dark, painful swellings popped up under the arms, along the neck, in the groin. Big, hot, angry lumps the size of eggs or apples. Doctors called them buboes. Skin around them turned black and dead-looking. People started vomiting blood, coughing up dark, sticky stuff. Some dropped right in the street while heading to market. Others suffered for a couple of days before the end came quietly. Whole families vanished overnight. Church bells rang and rang for the dead, so much the towns finally had to stop them because the constant tolling was making everyone lose their minds with fear. Graveyards filled up faster than anyone could dig. So they started opening huge trenches just outside the city walls, massive pits where bodies were laid in rows like firewood, sprinkled with a bit of lime, then barely covered with soil. Streets that used to be alive with the sounds of vendors calling out, kids playing, hammers ringing on anvils, went completely quiet. All you'd hear was the occasional cry of pain or the slow shuffle of feet as the last healthy people tried to run. From sunny ports in Italy to chilly villages in the north of England, the same question hung over every home, every tavern, every church. Is this the end of the world? What nobody realized back then was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic humanity had ever seen up to that point. Today, historians figure between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, roughly 30 to 60% of everybody, maybe 25 to 50 million souls, were gone between 1347 and 1351. Some cities lost half their people, others lost 3/4. Entire little villages disappeared so completely that we don't even know their names anymore. This was the Black Death, a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats. It spread because of a perfect, awful storm, changing weather, booming trade routes, people moving around more than ever. Once it started rolling, there really was no stopping it. To truly feel how heartbreaking this was, let's step back first into the beautiful, hopeful world the plague tore apart. The early 1300s weren't dark and miserable the way some old stories make them sound. This was actually the high point of what we called the High Middle Ages, a time when things felt stable, when the population was growing fast, when people felt connected in ways they never had before. A long stretch of nice weather, what scientists now call the medieval warm period, had given Europe mild winters and long sunny summers for generations. Fields produced bumper crops year after year: wheat, barley, oats, grapes for wine. Europe's population had almost doubled since the year 1000, going from about 35 million to somewhere between 70 and 80 million by 1300. Cities were bursting at the seams. Paris was heading toward 200,000 people, a noisy, exciting, crowded place, full of narrow streets, half-timber houses leaning close together, and huge Gothic cathedrals rising higher every year. Florence, Venice, Genoa, London, Barcelona, all of them were alive with trade, craftsmen, bankers, scholars. Those Gothic cathedrals were something special. Notre Dame, Chartres, the early work on Milan's cathedral, massive stone buildings that seemed to say, we're reaching closer to heaven than anyone ever has. Universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford were buzzing with debates about Aristotle, theology, medicine, law. And the big thing? The world felt linked together like never before. The Mongol Empire had created what historians called the Pax Mongolica, decades of relative peace across those huge steppes, and it turned the old Silk Road into the safest, quickest overland highway since Roman times. A merchant standing on the docks in Venice could sell silk from China, pepper from India, carpets from Persia, goods that had traveled thousands of miles without ever leaving the Mediterranean trade routes. It was the first real taste of globalization on that scale. People felt optimistic, ambitious, connected. But that same network of caravans, ships, and roads was about to carry something nobody could see coming. The killer started way out east, in the wide-open grasslands of Central Asia, probably somewhere around the Tian Shan Mountains in what's now Kyrgyzstan, or the high plains north of China near Lake Issyk-Kul. For thousands of years, Yersinia pestis had lived quietly among wild rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, gerbils. Fleas, especially a kind called the oriental rat flea, carried it from one animal to the next. When a rodent died, its hungry fleas jumped to the next warm body they could find. Then, around the 1330s, something threw everything off balance. Long droughts scorched the grass. Then heavy rains came and flooded burrows, wiped out food. Starving and stressed, infected rodents started moving closer to human trading posts and caravanserai along the Silk Road. The jump to people happened quick and brutal. High fevers, vomiting, terrible pain as buboes swelled up in the closest lymph nodes to the flea bite. In the worst cases, it went septicemic, poisoning the blood, or pneumonic, hitting the lungs so it could spread just by breathing the same air. Rumors started drifting west along those trade routes. By the early 1340s, merchants arriving in Mediterranean ports were telling stories that sounded like nightmares. Whole regions in Cathay and India emptied out, cities standing silent, tales of rains of fire mixed in with the sickness. Folks in Europe listened with a kind of faraway shock, thinking of it as God's judgment on far-off lands. They didn't know about germs. They had no clue that the same spices they sprinkled on their food and the silk in their fine clothes were traveling the exact same paths as this invisible killer. Everything changed for Europe in 1346 on the Crimean Peninsula at a busy Genoese trading colony called Caffa. Caffa was rich and important, a fortified port that linked Asian overland trade to Mediterranean shipping. It was under siege by the army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. The Mongols had carried the plague with them from their steppe campaigns. Soon their camps turned deadly, thousands dying every day, bodies turning black, buboes bursting open. Facing complete defeat, Janibeg made a terrible choice, one of the first times in history anyone used disease as a weapon on purpose. He ordered catapults loaded with the corpses of his plague-dead soldiers and had them thrown over Caffa's walls. For days, rotting bodies rained down into the streets, onto rooftops, into market squares. The smell was unbearable. But the real horror was the fleas leaving cold bodies for warm ones inside the city. When the siege finally broke, the Genoese merchants loaded 12 galleys with whatever they could grab, refugees, cargo, and rats nobody noticed, and sailed west. Those ships touched Constantinople, which fell hard by late 1347, then spread into the Mediterranean, the beating heart of Europe's economy. October 1347, the galleys arrive in Messina, Sicily. Dock workers row out to meet them and find most of the crew dead or delirious, bodies covered in oozing black boils. The few survivors are coughing blood. Authorities try to send the ships away. Too late. Black rats run down the mooring ropes onto the docks. Fleas bite dock workers, porters, families. Messina collapses in weeks. People panic and flee into the countryside, carrying the plague farther. From Sicily, it jumps to Genoa, Marseille, Venice, Barcelona, then up to London by summer 1348. Venice, always clever and practical, starts the first real quarantine. Ships and crews isolated on islands in the lagoon for 40 days, 40 giorni. It's a smart idea that saves lives later, but way too late for that first terrible wave. From the coasts, the disease races inland, along rivers, old Roman roads, pilgrim paths, straight into the crowded hearts of cities. Imagine walking through Florence or Paris in 1348. Narrow, twisting streets, timber houses leaning so close overhead they block out most of the sunlight. Open gutters running down the middle, carrying waste straight to the rivers. No real sanitation. Perfect home for rats and the fleas riding on them. Doctors back then are doing the best they can with what they know, but they're completely outmatched. They still follow ancient Greek ideas. Sickness comes from imbalance of the body's humors and bad miasma in the air. They blame a rare alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that supposedly released poisonous vapors from the ground. Their treatments are harsh and, sadly, make things worse. Bleeding patients until they're even weaker, burning juniper and rosemary in the streets to clean the air, telling people not to bathe because opening pores lets bad air in, lancing the buboes, spreading the infection faster. Giovanni Boccaccio lived through it in Florence, which lost maybe 60% of its 100,000 people. In the Decameron, he wrote honestly, "The plague was so cruel that fathers and mothers avoided their own children as if they were strangers. Brother abandoned brother. The sick were left to die alone. Many dropped dead in the open streets while going about their daily business. Society just stopped working. Laws went unenforced because there were hardly any magistrates left alive. Courts closed, bakeries went dark, markets stood empty. Only the tolling of bells until even the bell ringers started dying. Bodies piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Churchyards overflowed. Huge plague pits were dug outside the walls. Trenches where corpses were layered like cordwood, dusted with lime, covered with a thin layer of earth. When prayers and processions didn't bring relief, things got darker. Crowds packed into cathedrals, hoping for miracles, only spreading the lung version of the plague faster through coughs. Priests died as fast as anyone, sometimes faster, because they stayed to comfort the sick. In Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of France, a movement called the Flagellants took hold. Hundreds of men marched from town to town, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves with iron-spiked scourges until blood ran down their backs, public acts of penance meant to turn God's anger away. It was a frightening sight, but it didn't stop the dying. When even that failed, people started looking for someone to blame. Rumors spread like wildfire. Jews were poisoning wells to wipe out Christians. Pope Clement VI put out official statements saying it was nonsense. Jews were dying just as fast as everyone else, but the mobs didn't care. Pogroms swept through the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, about 900 Jews were burned alive on a huge wooden platform. Mainz lost its entire Jewish community, one of the biggest in Europe. Cologne, Frankfurt, and many other places saw the same tragedy. The Black Death didn't just take lives. It cracked open the worst parts of human fear and turned it into hate. Cities suffered the most, but the plague didn't stay inside the walls. 90% of people in Europe lived in the countryside, scattered villages, manors, little hamlets. Refugees, traveling peddlers, deserters carried it from place to place. Thousands of small settlements were wiped out completely, gone so thoroughly that we don't even have their names in the records anymore. Fields went unharvested, crops rotting on the stalk. Sheep and cattle wandered off untended, turning wild or starving. Wolves, usually kept away by people, started coming closer to the few survivors left. The neat, carefully tended medieval countryside began slipping back towards wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached Scotland, Scandinavia, even the far-off Norse settlements in Greenland, giving those distant outposts a final fatal blow. Then, in 1351, the first great wave finally slowed. There simply weren't enough living people left for it to keep spreading at full speed. The numbers are hard to wrap your head around.
Europe lost 25 to 50 million people. Across the wider world, 75 to 200 million. The people who made it through walked into a world that looked the same on the outside, but felt completely different inside. Labor became so scarce that peasants, who used to have almost no say, suddenly had real power. Lords had to offer higher wages, switch from forced labor to cash rents, even give more freedom just to get fields planted and harvested. The old feudal systems started cracking in ways it never had before. For a little while, historians talk about a golden age of the laborer: better pay, more food on the table, a bit more independence. But the emotional scars ran deep. Art became full of images of death. The danse macabre showed up everywhere, skeletons leading popes, kings, peasants, kids, in a final dance where everyone ends up equal. Faith in the old ways took a hit too. When prayers didn't work, when priests died just like everyone else, people started asking harder questions. Those questions helped lay the groundwork for later changes: religious reforms, the Renaissance, even the scientific ideas that came centuries later. The Black Death broke the bright, confident spirit of the High Middle Ages. It showed that even the grandest, most connected, most faithful civilization could be brought down by something nobody could see. And out of all that pain and loss came slow, hard adaptation, the first steps towards the modern world we know today. Empty streets, locked doors, fear of breathing the same air as the person next to you, families torn apart in a single night. Does any of that sound like something from a long ago storybook? Or does it feel a little too close to things we've seen in our own time? The plague was one of the biggest tests humanity has ever faced, and tests like that, they have a way of coming back around. I'm Zahid, watching the past so we can understand the present a little bit better, and together we keep history alive and breathing. I'll see you in the next era.